Hello and welcome. This is Casey, and in today's video I will be doing something of an introduction or an overview to the Iridology Brain Zones. And for the purposes of this video, I will be focusing more so on the anatomical correlations between the features of the brain and those of the brain zones. So while we will touch on some of the key words, and of course we'll look at the name and location of the brain zones, I would like this video to serve as a basis for future videos in which I will go into more detail on each brain zone. But for today, I just really wanted to show you the connection between different physical features of the brain, different organs and different glands of the brain, different areas of the brain, and how they relate to the brain zones. And the brain zones were pioneered by Dr. Bernard Jensen, and as such I will be following primarily from his work today. And in future videos I will bring in the discussion and research from several other iridologists on the brain and the brain zones. And so after we take a look at the brain zones, we're going to be looking at some of the signs that we may find in the iris, indicating different levels of health and vitality within the head and brain area. And then before we get started, I have a brief quote from Bernard Jensen, and he says, "Every physical organ has a representative motor center in the brain to sustain its function. Every organ of perception has its reception in the brain to receive and respond to experience. Nerves with cell bodies or dendrites and the hypothalamus connect with both parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems in the brainstem and spinal cord, regulating and coordinating the autonomic functions of all physical organs. Nerves of the cortex are connected to the thalamus and hypothalamus so that every thought, every feeling influences the function of every cell in the body." And he says, "Each human being that unfolds from the fusion of egg and spermatozoa is a miracle. Through cell division and differentiation, the brain, spinal cord, and nervous system merge in a body molded to express soul faculties that entered into that first divine spark of life in the initial living cell. Gifts, talents, abilities, innate intelligence, soul memories, and faculties are latent as the body and brain develop to fulfill their expression." All right, so let's get started. All right, so we're going to start here with this diagram of the brain, and I have placed alongside that an iris chart that shows the actual anatomy of the brain area from the 11 to 1 region. And then from here we'll go into the actual brain zones. But I thought it would be nice to see this visual of how the brain anatomy is laid out in the iris chart, and so we can reference that while we're looking at the brain. Okay, so what I have here primarily is from Bernard Jensen, and he says the developing eyes first appear in the 22-day-old embryo as grooves in the forebrain wall. The retina, ciliary body, and iris begin to form about the 5th week. After the 5th week, the developing eye is surrounded by loose tissue, the inner layer of which becomes the choroid, the outer layer which becomes the sclera. The eyes are first attached to the optic stalk, which becomes the optic nerve. And he says, "My point here is that the eyes are made of brain tissue and retain the sensitivity characteristic of this highly evolved tissue. This is why the eyes are so revealing." And then we're going to go into a brief summary of some of these anatomical features. And again, he says, from an evolutionary perspective, the spinal cord and medulla represent the primitive elementary brain, the basic survival mechanism. And so we have the spinal cord here and the medulla here. And through the ages, the development of the midbrain and cerebellum, called the mammalian brain, added more complex features. The cerebrum represents the highest stage of evolutionary development, the stage of brain development which allows for such complex activities as communication, conscious learning, and elaborate forms of social behavior and organization. All right, so we have the cerebellum, which means little brain, and that is in the posterior inferior position of the head. And then we have the cerebrum in this area, which is taking up the majority of the brain real estate. And the largest portion of the brain is the cerebrum, divided into hemispheres and covered with a thin layer called the cerebral cortex, long celebrated as the thinking portion of the brain. In fact, scientists are not exactly certain what takes place in the cortex. The diencephalon lies between the cerebrum and the midbrain, and its most important structures are the thalamus and hypothalamus, the nerve relay centers which monitor tissue conditions in all parts of the body and forward that information via neural pathways to the irides. So just to pause here, we can take a look at this iris chart. You can see the cerebellum in the left portion right around 11 o'clock, and where it says central nervous system. Hoping you guys can see this, but just in case if you can't, this says central nervous system. That would be for the most part the cerebrum. And then below that we have corpus callosum, which on this chart, this brain here, the corpus callosum is this white area. So corpus callosum. And then also of interest would be the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the pineal gland. And so here we see in the iris chart, the thalamus is above the hypothalamus, and which is above the pituitary gland, and then we can see that reflected also in this brain. So we have the hypothalamus, and then above that in this area is the thalamus, and then of course the pituitary, and then behind that, somewhat more centered, is the pineal gland. The cerebellum, second largest part of the brain, is located under the posterior part of the cerebrum. The midbrain lies below the cerebrum and above the pons. Together, the medulla, pons, and midbrain make up the brain stem, the medulla being formed by an enlargement of the superior portion of the spinal cord. The iris area reflexly representing the brain is divided into two major parts: the cerebrum, or psychological brain, which is primarily organized for conscious sensory motor activity, and the cerebellum, or physiological brain, which functions below the level of consciousness. These are hypothetical divisions intended to represent the distinction between the higher or conscious level of function associated with the cerebrum and the lower or subconscious level of physiological function associated with the cerebellum and brain structures other than the cerebrum. In actuality, the higher and lower brain structures and functions are intimately related through neural pathways by means of which each is constantly monitoring and modifying the activities of the other. We find that the emotions are affected by the biochemical state of the body, our thoughts are affected by the circulation of the blood, our degree of alertness is affected by the state of muscular tension. In fact, there is no physical, chemical, or electrical process in the body which does not affect our state of consciousness. At the same time, the reverse is also true. Our thoughts, emotions, and other conscious processes directly or indirectly affect the functioning of every cell in our bodies. This, of course, is the basis of the holistic approach to health. All right, so from here, we are going to move on to a Bernard Jensen chart, and I have somewhat overlaid that or just placed it at the top of this anatomical artistic chart. So all I did, just for reference sake, and I do have both of these charts. I have this one, this Bernard Jensen chart, have it in a pretty good high resolution. I finally purchased online because all the ones I could get my hand on were just not high enough resolution, and then I cropped out the 11:1 areas, and you can even, I did do this in one case, just I was playing around, you can also create a transparency, and so you can make it transparent, you can crop it out and then make it transparent, and then literally place that over an iris. Or you can use software if you have a camera that comes with software, or you can just map the brain zones out by hand. And so this was done just to more give you an idea of the location of the brain zones. I thought it was the easiest way. So yeah, anyway, I have this chart from this artist on my website. You can download, as well as the more high definition Bernard Jensen chart on my website as well. So getting into these brain zones or brain flares as pioneered by iridologist Bernard Jensen, they are essentially a mapping of brain function through anatomical regions and their respective placement within the iris. Markings in the brain area of the iris relate a state of health or tissue integrity within the brain. And it is through the science of iridology we are able to discern through various markings the state of health or tissue integrity within the cells, tissues, and organs of the brain. Signs that indicate varying levels of strength and vitality versus signs indicating inflammation, lymphatic congestion, and even chronic and destructive or degenerative tissue states that may manifest as challenges, including brain fog, memory loss, impaired brain function, brain tissue degeneration, and many other physical, emotional, and mental challenges. As well, signs of destructive toxins or drugs with an affinity for and therefore bound to and burrowed within certain brain tissue, such as inorganic mineral deposits, resulting in a heavy metal encumbrance. So we will see some pigmentation in the brain zones. That's one of the signs we're going to be looking for, along with lacuna, crypts, nerve rings, lymphatic tophi, things of that nature. All right, and as well as the state of health, we are able to have something of a window into one's innate talents, tendencies, and dispositions, mental aptitudes, and challenges, both inherited and acquired, which tend to exist upon a spectrum. So with each of these brain zones, there's going to be, and by the way, I'm going to do a video on a short video, hopefully on each one, where we'll go into more detail. Today I'm just going to give a few keywords, and as well I'm going to mention the anatomical correlation to the brain zones. But when we're looking at brain zones, just like when we're looking at anything else, we're seeing that they definitely exist upon a spectrum. So positive and so-called or perceived negative qualities of the same concept. So with animation life, for instance, we have joy, we have vitality, we have energy, we have zest for life. We have an open and connected crown chakra where we're able to receive inspiration. And then depending on the marking, you're going to notice that as positive attributes, or you're going to notice the opposite. So a closed down, shut down, dark, uninspired, non-energetic, disconnected state of mind and state of being. And so as well, these brain zones, or these qualities that do exist upon a spectrum, also interact with and depend upon one another. So we're seeing that no different than anything else in the body, especially it's true within the brain, that there are a million different connections that we're not seeing that we know do exist. So they're all relying on the strength and the qualities of one another, constantly interacting and depending upon one another. And I think it might be a little bit metaphorical to say also that, or I should say, that could be a metaphor for how tricky or challenging it can be to map these brain zones out. So along with what I noted with the chart, so you can crop the brain zones out, you can also make a transparency and then place that over the eye. And of course you can also map it out by hand and just divide up the 11:1 regions. I sometimes, if I see a lot of Radii Solaris or different markings within the brain zones, I'll just go ahead and get out my software that came with my camera, and it's not the best software in the world, but it just kind of takes the subjectivity out of the whole process, because a lot of times these brain zones, the markings will be really close together. You'll see different markings that span a few different brain zones, and that will give you a whole new opportunity to translate what that could imply for that person. Okay, and then as said by Bernard Jensen, we are born with latent cerebral potentials which can be developed through training and experience, or which remain latent if neglected. Each of the brain centers on the iridology chart has its own group of associated qualities. We may favor certain faculties over others, but the ideal is to develop and balance all of them, physical, mental, and spiritual. And then he says, however, when we abuse the brain and the nerves, they may degenerate into negative attributes. All right, so beginning with the Animation Life Center, this center is straight up, same in both irises at 12 o'clock. And Jensen says at 12 o'clock in both irises, we find the Animation Life Center, perhaps the most important functional area of the brain. I call this the Animation Life Center because it has to do with metabolism and the consequent level of energy available to carry out life activities. And so I will be attempting to limit myself to a brief description, as noted, of these brain zones, and more so describe their relationship or correspondence to the anatomy of the brain. And so for the Animation Life Center, he says, if we imagine a circular cross-section 2 or 3 inches in diameter, straight down through the center of the top of the skull, our hypothetical core would include limbic portions of the cerebrum, the thalamus, hypothalamus, including the pituitary gland, and pons. Basically, these are the anatomical areas represented functionally by the Animation Life Center. Also note that the pituitary gland intersects with the Animation Life Center in zone 3. Okay, and so a few keywords for this center, I think of it as the crown chakra, and it is related to, as the crown chakra is as well, the connection we have, the direct line of communication we have to the universe. And that would include our levels of vitality, inspiration, and love, joy, physical energy. And so those are some of the keywords on one side of the spectrum. And then the opposite of that would be feelings and emotions along the line of depression, despondency, and hopelessness. All right, and this center can have a little bit to do with the energy or fatigue center. It can also have a little bit to do with memory and brain fog, which again we'll go into because there are several areas of the brain and different signs you may see related to forgetfulness or brain fog. All right, so next we have, he says, moving from the animation life center clockwise in the left iris and counterclockwise in the right iris, we have divisions for sensory locomotion, inherent mental, equilibrium and dizziness, which is in the left iris only, and then sex impulse and mental sex, which is in the right iris only, and then lastly the medulla, which would be in the posterior section of the brain, so the back of the head. And so the next area that we're going to speak to is the sensory locomotion area here and here, and then it is anatomically related to the cerebellum, but not independent of the cerebrum. Rather, there's a close coordination and connection between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, as the cerebellum receives sensory nerve impulses from the muscles and joints and correlates these with impulses from visual, auditory, and other sensory centers of the cerebrum to initiate coordinated muscle movements. Okay, and then we'll see if I have any keywords for sensory locomotion. Essentially, it is how our senses guide us to stand and move in the world. It also works very closely with the five senses area, as you can imagine. High-level expression keywords would be movement, kinesthesia, and proprioception. Also, the senses of heat, touch, cold, pressure, things of that nature. And then low-level expression would be awkwardness, imbalance, and then insensitivity to these same senses. All right, and then after that, we have the inherent mental area. And inherent mental has a direct connection and relationship to, as it creates a diagonal line, the adrenal glands. So this is the center, also known as the anxiety center. And when you're checking for anxiety, or you're tracing down the root cause of anxiety for someone, you're going to be checking this brain zone as well as the adrenal glands. And according to Jensen, he says the inherent mental area, which corresponds to complex interactions between the alertness center and the reticular formation, the sensory centers and memory function of the cerebrum, and the emotional, pleasure, and pain centers of the limbic system, the hypothalamus, and the cerebrum. The reticular formation center, which helps control the degree of alertness, may be the key in this system of interactions. And some key words may be some high-level expression. Keywords for the center would be love, aspiration, altruism, creativity, hope, and willpower, faith. Low level may be confusion, destructiveness, weakness, aversion, grief, dependency. even psychosis, impulsiveness. And of course, we're seeing that we do associate this brain zone to anxiety, so anxiety would be one of those keywords as well. Okay, and then moving on, we have the equilibrium dizziness center in the left iris, most definitely in the cerebellum. So equilibrium dizziness in the left iris. In the cerebellum, we can see that. And let me see if I can find some keywords. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of research on this zone, and especially from earlier iridologists, and they likened it to epilepsy. So there is that condition connected to the equilibrium and dizziness center. Definitely something to look out for, and I will mention that when we go into that center in more detail. And so, but in general, that would be the extreme, more low level and hypo functioning of the center. But high level expression would be equilibrium, smooth muscle coordination, balance, walking smoothly and easily. And then again, low level would be the epilepsy center, lack of coordination, imbalance, tremor, staggering, and dizziness. This area, again, like we said, involves the cerebellum. It also includes the brain stem and parts of the sensory motor cortex. The most important keyword I would say for this center is equilibrium. All right, and then we're going to move on to the mental sex area, sex impulse. I refer to it as the sexuality brain zone. And the sexuality brain zone actually has a relationship to the sexual organs in a diagonal fashion, the reproductive organs. So we have that. We're always going to be looking for relationships, be they diagonals or sometimes we'll see transversals in the iris fibers. And so that would be one thing that we're looking for when we're looking at the overall big picture of the eye. Okay, so this center is the primitive sex drive, a basic survival mechanism, is located in the brain stem. So towards the back of the head, very close to the medulla. And there are physiological interactions between the cerebrum and the hypothalamus. And that would be in the, again, this is in the right eye only. So there is something of a connection between these two brain zones, the equilibrium and dizziness, and the sex impulse area, but they are the only two brain zones that appear just one single brain zone in each eye. So I think that is significant. And after we, a few keywords. So positive level keywords or expression, high level expression would be creativity, motherhood, fatherhood, healthy sexual attraction and activity, family instinct, excitement, passion. And then low level would be the opposite of that. So fear of the opposite sex will show up here, and that often is related to past experiences. And envy, fight or flight. We have indiscriminate sex, perversion, and frigidity and sterility. So yeah, we'll go into that in more detail when we get to that brain zone. All right, and then lastly, for this region of the brain, we are still in the posterior back of the brain. The last brain zone is the medulla brain zone. And the medulla essentially is at the top of the brain stem, and along with the vagus, 10th cranial nerve controls respiration and diaphragmatic coughing, hiccuping, sneezing, swallowing, vomiting, salivation, heart regulation, vasomotor response, facial expressions, hearing, digestive, and other paramount nervous system survival and balancing mechanisms aimed at the preservation of vital functions in daily life and during times of stress. All right, so high level expression will be normal respiration, normal heart rate, normal vasomotor, and then you can have at the lower level of expression, and we'll get into this in just a few minutes, and also when we cover each brain zone, every single sign that you're going to see is going to indicate a different varying level of health. So if you were to see any dark markings, especially dark Radii Solaris or even lacuna in any area of the brain, they're going to be more indicating the lower level expression keywords. And so those lower level expression keywords would be ragged respiration, above or below normal heart rate, high or low blood pressure, shallow breathing, to name a few. All right, and so now we're going to go on to the opposite side of the animation life center, and you can see now we're going to be getting into the pituitary gland and the pineal gland, and we're going to be seeing how they may be affecting these different brain zones. So on the opposite side of the animation life center, moving counterclockwise in the left iris and clockwise in the right iris, we find the 5 senses area, ego pressure, the acquired mental and speech areas, and mental ability. This is the cerebrum area, or psychological brain, which is associated primarily with conscious experience rather than automatic functions and responses. Again, we must realize that every conscious experience has an effect upon the autonomic nervous system and sometimes on the glandular system, which can result in changes in organs, body tissue, and the circulation of the blood, as well as physiological changes also can affect the mental state. And then he notes also that the pituitary gland, master gland of the endocrine system, is in zone 3 at the base of the animation life center, the 5 senses area, ego pressure, as well as acquired and mental speech areas. Okay, and let's just go through these last few brain centers, and starting with the 5 senses. The 5 senses area, as mentioned, is located in the cerebrum, and the 5 senses area involves all of the 5 senses and is also very much connected to the organs or the anatomical features of the body that work these senses. So the ears, the eyes, the hands, the feet for, for touch and sensitivity to heat and cold. And so in positive states, this zone augments the highly tuned senses of a musician or blind person whose auditory and tactile senses are more acute. If it's hyperactive, in which case you would see white, signs of white among a few other signs. It can lead to overindulgence and hedonistic practices. Hypoactivity can be the cause of sensory disadvantages or impaired sensation, self-denial, guilt, severe disciplines, and criticism of those who enjoy life. Okay, and then we have perfectionism, self-stress, and then most known, especially by those who follow Bernard Jensen's work, as the ego pressure zone. And the ego pressure zone, again, located in the limbic system, the emotional brain of the cerebrum, that is, as well as it is connected to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And just a few key words. The perfectionism pressure brain zone governs blood pressure, regulates decision making, psychological stress reactions, sexual activity, achievement of ideals and goals, and how we pressure ourselves about them. I would say that would be the most important phrase right there. Achievement of our ideals and goals and how we pressure ourselves about them. And what kind of pressure we put on ourselves often is where you hear that word perfectionism. And it's about how we pressure ourselves to achieve our dreams. And Radii Solaris mentions here that the blood pressure relationship is a defense against stress. And we have another radial relationship with the center to the appendix area. And I will go into that at some point. And then another quote by Jensen: ego pressure has primarily to do with the effect of cerebral stress, what a person thinks of himself in total. The center expresses power, concentration, drive, and these qualities can become quite harsh on the nervous system. This is the blood pressure center, and iris signs in this area can be associated with either high or low blood pressure. The center has to do with physiological and psychological stress, ambition, decision-making, and anxiety levels. So high-level expressions, a few keywords would be success, drive, memory, ambition, and then low-level expression would be domination, harshness, greed, selfishness, vanity, arrogance, impatience, and so forth. All right, and so after that we have acquired mental speech. And this forebrain zone contains pineal and pituitary glands, cerebrum, and the hypothalamus. It is known as the brain communication center, also referred to as listening, learning, and speaking. So positive qualities related to communication would be found here, as well as negative qualities of communication, or even hypoactive qualities of communication, which would result in difficulties in finer intellectual capabilities, communication in general. So specifically, imbalanced function may lead to dyslexia, stuttering, and inability to concentrate, as well as lack of interest and forgetfulness. All right, so the last brain zone we are going to highlight today is the mental ability brain zone, and you can see its proximity in location and similarity in name to the acquired mental speech zone, and perhaps have some sympathy for my journey in fully understanding these brain zones, as a lot of them sound similar and are similar, as they do share real estate, if you will, of the brain area. So they're both located in the frontal area of the brain, and this one in particular corresponds to the frontal and prefrontal cerebral cortex, the section of the brain where we organize experience, perceptions, and ideas about the world. And this brain zone, I associate this brain zone with the pineal gland, as it is superior to the pineal gland or located just above it. And depending on the different markings you may see in the iris, you may notice positive attributes or, again, more negative attributes, or just qualities that are on the other end of the spectrum. But like I said, it is all about organizing experience, perceptions, and ideas. It also encourages intelligence, logic, reasoning, memory, willpower, and voluntary movement. According to Frieda, many creative, intelligent, critical, exact, and sensitive qualities thrive in this artistic brain zone during heightened activity. However, when out of balance, inspiration is blocked, tension dominates mental processes, negativity takes root, and perverse tendencies are experienced. All right, so that should do it for a summary of the brain zones. And next we're going to take a look at some eyes, and we're going to look at some more specific signs that you may see related to iridology, the science of iridology, what kind of markings you might see within these brain zones and what they may be indicating. All right, so see you in a second. All right, so we're now going to take a look at some of the signs in the iris that may be indicating differing levels of health, vitality, function, and dysfunction related to the head and brain area. And as an iridology student or practitioner, you will note that we are essentially looking at universal signs. So in other words, we're going to be looking at nerve rings, we're going to be looking at Psora or pigmentation, Radii Solaris, lacuna, things of that nature. And when we get into more specific brain zone definitions and we delve deeper into each brain zone, we will see that these different signs may indicate different things as they are related to the specific function of that area. All right, so but for now we're going to be fairly basic and cover some of the more common signs. And I will just read to you what I have from Bernard Jensen, and he says, when we come to the brain area of our iridology chart, we look for several conditions. We look for lesions or crypts. So we're going to be looking for lesions, lacuna, crypts, any kind of breaks or openings in the iris fibers, as well as loose fiber structure. And these would be indicating inherent weaknesses. And we're going to be looking at, according to Jensen, signs of the Arcus Senilis and or anemia, especially as this relates to, and we'll see that anemia in the bluish haze that we see in the periphery of the iris. When we see that blue haze in the periphery, that can be indicating anemia, and then the Arcus Senilis is more in the superior area of the eye or the head and brain area. And both of those would be indicating a lack of circulation to the brain. And so we're going to be looking for anemia. Arcus Senilis, the sodium, calcium, or cholesterol ring, and I'm just going to be simplifying that. There are subtle variations on the difference between sodium and cholesterol in the iris periphery as a ring. Both of those, as well as calcium, both of those would indicate hardening of the arteries. And we're also going to be looking at signs of lymphatic congestion. And that can be in the form of lymphatic tophi or just clouds, thick clouds indicating lymphatic congestion. Varying the color will tell us whether we're in the acute or chronic or degenerative stages. We're also going to be looking at nerve rings, especially nerve rings that start or end in the brain area. So in this iris in particular, you see we have several nerve rings all throughout, and not any more so up in the head and brain area than throughout the rest of the iris, but we do have this dark clouding up in the head and brain area, which to me will be indicating more of a chronic condition. But then the nerve rings themselves are more white, which would be indicating more of an acute condition. Okay, so we'll be looking at nerve rings and Radii Solaris. So this iris has plenty of those, and we're going to be looking at whether they are Radii Solaris minor or major, whether they extend all the way from the pupillary margin up into the brain area, or if they only extend into maybe the third or fourth zone. All right, and then we're also, this eye has a lot to look at. We're also going to be looking at deformations in the autonomic nerve ring pulling toward or away from the brain area. I'm not seeing the autonomic nerve wreath in this eye. And then we also will be looking for reflex conditions from the bowel area. Okay, so especially with the transverse colon, we're going to be seeing if the hypoactivity or degeneration in the brain via the Radii Solaris are originating at the transverse colon, which they will be, and so that would be a clue as to how you would approach finding balance and health for that person. Okay, and we also see here some pigmentation, so we'll be talking about that, very much looking at pigmentation, as we know that certain toxic substances, especially be they fluoride or heavy metals, can settle in the brain area. And all of this is going to help us, like I just mentioned, develop a plan, a cohesive, coherent plan for this person or for ourselves to heal. Okay, and he also says when we find an abnormal sign in the brain area, we also check the opposite side of the chart. So we're going to be looking for reflex signs, so diagonal lines that run from one brain zone to another area of the iris chart. And then Jensen notice that the animation life center is across from the thigh, knee, and foot area at 6 o'clock. And of course, there's a correlation between the level of energy and vitality that we have and our legs, you know, moving forward, getting stuff done, taking steps in life. And he says, also note that the sex impulse area at 11:30 in the right iris is opposite the sex gland and organ area a little after 5 o'clock. Keep in mind that we are looking for correspondences, opposites, and reflex conditions, as well as other signs. Okay, and just a few more eyes here. So here we have classic signs, we have nerve rings, and they do extend up into the head and brain area, and we have Radii Solaris, major. This would be one of those eyes that I would probably want to map out. Possibly even on my computer, just so that, like I said, it's more subjective or objective, less subjective, because there are a lot of them, and I'm guessing that this one here, which is quite deep, may be affecting two different brain zones. All right, so we have that. And then a very small, almost like a little crypt-like, a diamond-shaped lacuna. So we will be seeing those. And one last thing that he says about the overall health of the brain centers, the brain. And he says the development of these qualities and these faculties require good inherent structure. So we're looking at fiber density and good brain and nerve nutrition. So we'll speak to that. Elimination of toxic settlements, which we saw with the pigmentation. And we'll see in the next eye also has some pigmentation, and efficient circulation of blood through the brain. And then let me see if there's anything else here. I think I'm going to go on. The last thing he says, this is a great eye showing a few different signs. We have some pigmentation in this area. It's very light. I'm guessing that it's not like a Psora that has burrowed down into the iris fibers, but nevertheless, there is pigmentation indicating some toxic settlement in that area and throughout the iris. So we would check what brain zone that is. We would check to see if these would be more like Radii Solaris minor, and we would see if they do extend, if they are extending from, say, the pituitary or pineal gland, if they extend all the way through into the brain zone or not. These don't really seem to. However, there are a lot of white iris fibers indicating hyperactivity. And that will lead me to my last quote from Jensen, He says the iris brain zones encompass the hypothalamus discriminating activities, the cerebral cortex, pituitary pineal, subtle psychic energies, and spiritual centers. Hyperactivity is recognized by whitening of the area that may be accompanied by headaches or a hot head. Depletion is measured by varying shades of darkness in lacunas, radii solaris, pigmentation, lymphatic tophi, and defects. Reflexive fibers and nerve rings also denote irritation. And then lastly, observe whether there are markings in the brain zones to add polarity relationships. The circulatory hardening ring, Arcus Senilis, or the anemia ring also indicate diminished vitality, memory, and concentration levels. All right, so that should about do it. I do see in this area, this is interesting because we have, like I said, it doesn't necessarily even need to be a lacuna. Like we have a lacuna right here. And this sort of does look like one to me, but it's not as straightforward. But we see that the waviness of the fibers lends itself to the separation in the iris fibers here. So that may be connected to this radii solaris in this area. Okay, so I think that should about do it. And I am going to, if you've been to my website, you know, I have also, ooh, there are really interesting, I didn't even notice this. I'm sure some of you have, right? There are lymphatic tophi also in the brain area. So there is going to be a matter of lymphatic congestion showing up in this iris, and it's not acute, it's chronic. So it's not white lymphatic tophi. That may be why it didn't come across my radar. It's more tan, which is, like I said, indicating more chronic, possibly subacute, but chronic levels of lymphatic congestion. And then back to what I was saying, I will, if you've been to my website, you know I'm compiling research on iridology, so I have a lot of resources there for you to look at. And once I get my notes from this video organized, I will put them on there, and you'll be able to look in more detail about the iris brain zones. And then I'll be following up with some more videos on each brain zone. So thanks so much for watching, and take good care, and I will see you next time. Okay, bye.